Every empire believes its greatness is permanent, that what was built by centuries of work cannot vanish in a single generation, that the middle class, the quiet heart of civilization, will always endure. But history disagrees. The day an empire's middle class dies is not marked by war or invasion. It happens silently, in the marketplace where prices rise faster than wages, in the suburbs where families can no longer afford the homes their parents bought, in the eyes of a worker who realizes effort no longer equals progress. That is the real moment of collapse, when ordinary people stop believing that hard work can change their lives. Because when that belief dies, the empire follows. Rome called them citizens. Britain called them workers. America called them the middle class. Different names, same promise that freedom means a fair chance, that life is more than survival. But every empire that rose on the strength of its middle class eventually turned that strength into weakness. The Roman farmer became a debtor. The British craftsman became a laborer. The American homeowner became a renter. And when the middle could no longer hold society split clean in two, those who owned everything and those who owned nothing. What follows is always the same: first resentment, then unrest, then replacement. The rulers call it decline. The people call it betrayal. History calls it inevitable. Because the middle class is not an income bracket, it is balance. It is the space between hunger and excess, between chaos and control. It is what makes freedom work. When that balance collapses, so does the illusion of stability. The palaces stand, the markets trade, the armies march, but the soul of the nation is already gone. This is the story of how that happens, how Rome lost its citizens, how Britain lost its workers, how America is losing its middle class now, not through war, but through arithmetic, the silent math of inequality that always eventually destroys the world in between. History does not repeat word for word, it repeats in rhythm. And the rhythm of collapse always begins the same way, not with conquest, not with revolution, but with concentration. When the rewards of production are shared, civilizations expand. When they narrow to a few hands, civilizations decay. Economists call it the Pareto curve, 80% of wealth controlled by 20% of people. But as empires mature, the ratio sharpens: 20 becomes 10, 10 becomes 1, until a single percent owns more than the rest combined. At first, this seems harmless, even efficient. The rich invest, the system grows, the poor aspire. But growth built on inequality is not growth, it's gravity. It pulls everything toward the top until the foundation cracks. Every empire experiences this moment. Rome, when the small farmer lost his land to the latifundia. Britain, when industrial wages fell behind capital gains. America, when productivity rose and paychecks stood still. In each case, the story begins with innovation and ends with speculation. The builders give way to the bankers. The merchants give way to managers. The citizens give way to consumers. Wealth stops circulating. It starts accumulating quietly, invisibly at the top. And because wealth is power, the laws bend to preserve it. Tax codes favor ownership. Wages are called costs. Assets are called investments. Debts become the new currency of the poor. The middle class, once a buffer between wealth and want, becomes a borrower's class, earning less, owing more, hoping the next generation will fix what this one cannot. And as the center weakens, two illusions keep the system alive: credit, which replaces income, and optimism, which replaces truth. That is the pattern. It does not announce itself with fire or famine. It unfolds in balance sheets, mortgage rates, and headlines, that call inequality growth. Until one day the numbers reveal what politics cannot hide, that the distance between rich and poor has grown so vast that no bridge of belief can cross it anymore. That is when empires begin to die, not from invasion, but from imbalance. 2,000 years ago, Rome was not an empire. It was a republic of citizens' men who tilled their own fields, served in the legions, voted in assemblies. They were not rich, but they were free. Their independence was Rome's strength. But prosperity carries a hidden cost. The wars of conquest that filled Rome's coffers also hollowed its middle. The soldiers who returned from distant campaigns found their farms ruined, their debts unpayable. While they fought for the Republic was sold from beneath them. The aristocrats, the patricians, bought the foreclosed farms and merged them into vast estates called latifundia. Worked by slaves captured abroad, these estates could grow grain cheaper than any free farmer. The market decided efficiency. The middle class, Rome's smallholders, disappeared. In their place rose two new classes: the idle rich, who measured their power in acres and gold, and the desperate poor, who crowded into the city seeking work that no longer existed. By 133 BC, the imbalance was visible from every marble step of the Senate. The Gracchus brothers tried to restore land to the citizens. Both were killed, murdered not by enemies, but by Rome itself. That was the sound of the middle class dying. What came next was predictable bread and circuses. The government began distributing free grain to calm the crowds. Public games replaced public virtue. The citizens who once owned the state became spectators of their own decline. Rome grew richer, but not Romans. Wealth pooled in the hands of a few families. The republic built on shared sacrifice turned into an oligarchy defended by hired legions. And when the money ran out, loyalty vanished with it. The soldiers who once fought for the republic began fighting for pay. When pay failed, they changed sides. Civil war followed. From the ashes rose Caesar the Savior, who promised order, the emperor who ended freedom. He was not the cause of Rome's fall. He was its consequence. By the time the Visigoths arrived at the gates 8 centuries later, the middle class had long since vanished. There were senators and slaves and little in between. The bridge that held the empire together had been gone for generations. If you had lived in those last days, you would not have seen fire and ruin at first. You would have seen something quieter coinage, losing its silver wages, shrinking as prices rose, young men leaving the fields for the cities, families selling heirlooms to survive another month. Collapse is not a single event. It is a mood that becomes normal. People stop expecting improvement. They adapt downward. They call survival stability. That was Rome in its twilight. Still magnificent from a distance, still powerful in appearance, but hollowed from within an empire without a middle, a pyramid balanced on air. When the sack finally came in 410 AD, it was not the end of Rome. It was simply the moment everyone realized the end had already happened. In the middle of the 19th century, Britain stood at the peak of human achievement. The first nation to harness steam, to master iron and coal, to industrialize the world. Its factories thundered with invention. Its navy ruled the seas. Its engineers built the rails that stitched continents together. Victorian London was the capital of progress. Manchester glowed red with foundries and smokestacks. Liverpool's ports fed the world. A century earlier, this small island had been a nation of farmers and merchants. Now it was the workshop of the world. For the first time in history, ordinary people, mill workers, machinists, clerks, could imagine a better life. The promise of modernity had created something rare and powerful, a genuine middle class. They bought homes with small gardens, read newspapers, sent their children to school. They believed the system worked because effort seemed to matter. But beneath the steam and optimism, something fragile was forming. The wealth that had once been built by craftsmen was being captured by capital. The men who owned the machines began earning more than the men who built them. And the further technology advanced, the more distant labor became from reward. By the 1870s, British manufacturing still dominated the globe, but profits were shifting upward to the investors, the shareholders, the aristocracy that now owned the industrial age. The workers were no longer participants in progress. They were its cost. Wages stagnated. Prices rose. Slums expanded in the shadow of mansions. The middle that industrialization had created was beginning to dissolve into the same two classes that Rome once knew, the few who owned and the many who served. The first warning came not from politics, but from machines. Other nations were learning to copy what Britain had invented. Germany built better steel. America built faster engines. Japan built cheaper textiles. And Britain, confident, proud, unchanging, kept doing what it had always done. When the global order shifted, Britain didn't. Its factories grew old. Its skills grew obsolete. Its capital chased profit abroad instead of rebuilding at home. The empire provided temporary comfort, but it also became a trap, a system built to extract, not to renew. By 1900, Britain produced half the world's iron, coal, and textiles. By 1950, it couldn't make steel at a competitive price. Its mills closed. Its shipyards went silent. Entire cities that had once defined progress, Birmingham, Sheffield, Glasgow, became monuments to decline. The middle class, the people who had believed the most in the industrial dream, were the first to feel it slip away. Their savings devalued through inflation. Their jobs replaced by imports, their homes inherited by children who could no longer afford to keep them. Britain's government tried to respond. It nationalized industries, printed money, expanded welfare. But these were treatments for symptoms, not cures. The disease was structural, a collapse of balance between labor and capital production, and speculation, reality, and illusion. The empire that once built the world's goods began importing them from its former imitators. Made in Britain became nostalgia. The workshop of the world had become a museum of its own history. And the same story that began with abundance ended in austerity. Because when an empire stops making things, it stops making meaning. The middle class is not just an economic force. It is a psychological anchor, the belief that effort has purpose. When that belief vanishes, so does the culture that depended on it. By the 1980s, Britain's landscape had changed beyond recognition. Mines closed, factories abandoned. The children of engineers became service workers, consultants, clerks in the financial towers of London. The wealth was still there, concentrated, abstract, and global, but the identity was gone. The British middle class had once been a symbol of fairness and ambition. Now it was trapped between nostalgia and debt. Owning a home required loans that lasted a lifetime. Raising a family meant juggling credit. Retirement meant hope rather than certainty. And through it all, the elites spoke the same language their Roman predecessors once had, that this was progress, that efficiency demanded sacrifice, that globalization was destiny. But destiny, like empire, has a cost. The more Britain outsourced, the less it owned. The more it financialized, the less it produced. The more it speculated, the less it believed in the dignity of work. By the 21st century, the pattern was complete. A nation that once produced half of the world's manufactured goods now imported nearly all of them. Its economy was built not on factories, but on finance, tourism, and speculation. The middle class, once the envy of the world, was shrinking in plain sight. Home ownership fell. Real wages stagnated. Household debt soared. The British dream's steady work, modest comfort, upward mobility had faded into memory. When the pandemic came in 2020, the illusion broke completely. Millions relied on government subsidies to survive. The financial elite doubled their wealth. The workers who had kept the nation alive, nurses, drivers, teachers, saw none of it. It was not a crisis. It was a revelation that the middle class had already died quietly long before anyone noticed. History had simply caught up. And so Britain joined Rome in the same unbroken lineage of decline, prosperity, creating inequality, inequality, breeding fragility, fragility, collapsing under its own weight. The empire did not fall because it was conquered. It fell because it forgot who built it, the men and women in the middle. Those who believed that effort mattered, that dignity was worth more than dividends, that a nation is not its palaces, but its people. For most of the 20th century, America was more than a country. It was a promise. The promise that if you worked hard, you could rise, that a factory worker could send his children to college, that a nurse could buy a home. That effort meant advancement, not survival. It was the first civilization in history to industrialize without monarchy, to mass-produce prosperity, to turn workers into homeowners and laborers into shareholders. For the first time since Rome, the world had a middle. And it was American. The numbers told the story. From 1945 to 1975, productivity and wages rose together. Each decade brought new homes, new cars, new confidence. A single income could raise a family. College was affordable, healthcare stable. The middle class was the spine of the republic, the invisible engine that powered democracy itself. But in the late 1970s, something began to shift quietly, almost imperceptibly. The charts that had once moved in unison started to diverge. Productivity kept climbing. Wages did not. For the first time, the value of work rose faster than the value of workers. What caused the break? Some blamed globalization, others automation. But the truth was simpler and older. The same ancient pattern had returned, capital rising, labor falling. In 1971, the dollar was unchained from gold. Money became belief. And belief became leverage. Finance replaced manufacturing as the heart of the economy. Wall Street replaced Main Street as the measure of success. And the middle class, the very thing that made America exceptional, began its long, slow disappearance. The factories that built the dream were silent by the 1990s. Detroit, once the symbol of abundance, turned to dust and crime. Steel towns in Pennsylvania, textile mills in the Carolinas abandoned. The workers who made America's prosperity real were told to retrain, to adapt, to innovate. But no training can replace a vanished wage. As jobs left, debt filled the gap. The American middle class didn't collapse overnight. It was replaced by credit. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, bridges to nowhere that kept the illusion alive. You could still buy the American dream. You just had to finance it. And finance became the new faith. Stocks rose, home values soared, and everyone believed prosperity was permanent. But it wasn't prosperity, it was inflation disguised as success. By 2008, the illusion shattered. The housing market built on leverage greed and speculation imploded. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Millions lost homes. And when the dust cleared, the middle class was smaller, weaker, more indebted than ever. Washington responded the only way empires ever do, by saving the top and sacrificing the rest. Trillions were printed. Markets recovered. Assets soared. But the recovery never reached the workers who lost everything. The rich became richer. The poor became poorer. And the middle became a myth. After 2008, something fundamental broke, not just economically, but spiritually. A generation entered adulthood knowing that effort no longer guaranteed stability, that education meant debt, not opportunity, that housing was for investors, not families, that the ladder of success had been pulled up and rented out. This was the moment America began to look like every empire before it, a glittering palace built on hollow foundations. The metrics confirmed it. In 1980, the top 1% owned 10% of national wealth. By 2020, they owned 33%. The bottom 50%, half the country owned just 2%. Median home prices rose 6 times faster than wages. Healthcare costs quadrupled. And household debt reached $17 trillion. The middle class that once defined America, 61% of the population in 1970, had fallen below 50% by 2020. For the first time, most Americans were not in the middle. They were below it. The divide was not just financial. It was cultural. One America lived behind gates, traded stocks, and speculated in assets. The other America rented, borrowed, and hoped. The dream that once united them now separated them, the dream of owning. Ownership of homes, of businesses, of futures had always been the core of American identity. But when ownership concentrates, democracy decays. Politics becomes performance, media becomes distraction, and citizens become spectators in an economy that no longer belongs to them. By the 2020s, the illusion was complete. Stock markets hit record highs, while 60% of Americans couldn't cover a $1,000 emergency. Unemployment figures improved, while real purchasing power declined. The government called it growth. People called it survival. Every empire rewrites decline as progress. Rome called it Pax Romana. Britain called it the Age of Commerce. America calls it the digital economy. But the mathematics remain unchanged. When a civilization creates billionaires faster than it creates parents who can afford to raise children, when money makes more money than people do when work is taxed, but speculation is celebrated, the end is already written. And just like Rome and Britain, America reached the same fork in the road: collapse or correction. Correction requires sacrifice. Collapse requires only denial. America chose denial. Each administration promised renewal, but no one dared confront the structure itself. The empire grew not by producing, but by printing. Its currency replaced its industry. Its narratives replaced its identity. By 2026, the divide will be visible from orbit cities of glass and privilege, surrounded by miles of decay, a nation where half the population rents everything and owns nothing, where the children of the middle class inherit debt instead of opportunity. And when the next downturn hits, as the cycles predict, it won't just erase wealth. It will erase belief. Because once the middle class vanishes, there is no illusion left to sustain the dream. Without a middle, there is no America, only Rome. Before the sack, only Britain before the decline, only another empire convinced that this time it's different. But history never repeats perfectly. It rhymes in sharper tones each century. And in that rhythm you can hear the hollow sound of the American dream, echoing through empty factories, hollowed suburbs, and the quiet hum of a nation living on borrowed time. There is a law beneath every empire's rise and fall, not written in constitutions or commandments, but in balance. The middle class is that balance. It is the stabilizer between extremes, the bridge between wealth and poverty, between privilege and despair. When it holds nations prosper, when it breaks civilizations fracture. Rome learned it in fire. Britain learned it in rust. America is learning it in debt. The collapse of a middle class does not begin with riots or revolutions. It begins with quiet arithmetic. When the cost of living grows faster than wages, when housing becomes speculation instead of shelter, when the next generation earns less than the last. That's how decline starts, not with chaos, but with compromise. People work more hours, take on more loans, give up more rest until exhaustion becomes normal. The illusion of stability hides the erosion beneath, and then without a single event, a nation wakes up divided into two realities, one that owns and one that owes. In history, this moment is always the prelude to something darker, because when the middle class disappears, the mechanisms of democracy go with it. The poor can protest, the rich can purchase influence. But only the middle independent, educated, and invested sustains the fragile balance between the two. Without that anchor, politics becomes theater, economics becomes extraction, and law becomes privilege. The symptoms are easy to recognize. Trust collapses. Institutions lose credibility. Conspiracy replaces conversation. Citizens retreat into tribes of belief, not classes of cooperation. Each side blames the other, unaware that both are falling through the same widening gap. That gap between promise and reality is where nations break. We've seen it before. In late Rome, bread was subsidized to hide hunger. In Britain, welfare expanded while wages stagnated. In America, stimulus checks filled the hole left by collapsing opportunity, each measure temporary, each generation weaker than the one before. Collapse is not a single catastrophe. It is a slow forgetting of values, of unity, of proportion. And it happens quietly because everyone thinks they can adjust a little longer. By the time they can't, the damage is done. When the middle class dies, two forces rise in its place: resentment and control. The poor grow resentful of the system that abandoned them. The rich grow fearful of the anger they can no longer ignore. Governments respond the only way they know, by tightening control. More surveillance, more bureaucracy. More laws meant to maintain order in a society that has already lost balance. You can watch this pattern unfold in real time. Look at the data, and it reads like an obituary. The top 1% owns more than the bottom 90%. Home ownership rates fall every year. Consumer debt reaches new records. Half of small businesses vanish within a decade. Trust in Congress, in media, in banks, all near historic lows. Every number is a line in the same eulogy: the middle is gone. And yet for most, the end doesn't look like disaster. It looks like fatigue. A nation tired of pretending. Tired of progress that never arrives. Tired of slogans about growth that only enrich the same few. That's how the final act begins, not in rage, but in resignation. People stop believing their voice matters. They stop voting. They stop saving. They stop caring. And when belief dies, the system that depends on it follows. In late-stage empires, power always migrates upward. Wealth buys access, access writes laws, laws secure wealth. The middle class, stripped of leverage, becomes audience instead of actor. The national story continues, but no one believes the script anymore. At that point, only two outcomes remain: reformation or reset. Reformation requires moral courage, the kind that admits mistakes and redistributes power before collapse demands it. It is rare. Rome failed to reform. Britain delayed too long. America still has a chance, but the window is closing. Reset, on the other hand, is brutal. It's what history calls revolution, bankruptcy, war, or the Great Reckoning. It's the moment the system purges itself by force, because it refused to change by choice. Empires don't plan resets. They stumble into them. The poor revolt, the rich retreat, and the center, the middle that once held it all together, is already gone. If you want to see the future, watch for the same sequence that ended the last three empires: Debt decay, division, denial. Debt expands until the numbers stop meaning anything. Decay spreads through institutions until competence is replaced by corruption. Division consumes public life until unity is impossible. And denial blinds leaders until the fall feels like fate. Each stage feeds the next. Each accelerates the fall. That is the anatomy of collapse. Not a bomb or a battle, but a silent unraveling, one paycheck, one protest, one policy at a time. When historians look back on this era, they will not describe one great crisis. They will describe the erosion of a middle class so gradual, so ordinary, that no one noticed until it was gone. And they will wonder how a civilization that reached the stars could not see the ground giving way beneath it. But history doesn't end at collapse. It ends at renewal. Every empire that lost its middle was reborn, smaller, humbler, wiser. Rome became Christendom. Britain became a democracy. What America becomes will depend on what its people remember when the illusion finally breaks. Because in the end, the middle class isn't just an economic layer. It's the conscience of civilization, the voice that says enough when the extremes grow deaf. And when that voice returns, as it always does, the new world that rises will remember one truth that every fallen empire forgot. Prosperity isn't measured by how much the rich own, but by how little the poor must endure. When an empire falls, it does not vanish. It sheds its illusions. Rome's ruins became the stones of cathedrals. Britain's decline gave birth to a welfare state. Every collapse rewrites power, but it also renews purpose. The death of the middle class is not the end of America. It is the end of pretending that wealth can replace worth, that speculation can replace work, that comfort can exist without balance. When the markets break and the debt burns away, what will remain are the things that cannot be bought: craft, honesty, courage, and community. The rebirth will not come from the towers of finance, but from the quiet hands that rebuild mechanics, fixing what others threw away, families turning lawns into gardens, neighbors trading skills instead of debts. It will not be televised. It will not trend. But it will spread one town, one workshop, one shared meal at a time. Because when everything artificial collapses, people remember what is real. The new America will not look like the old. It will be smaller, slower, more deliberate. But it will remember what its ancestors forgot, that freedom without virtue becomes greed, and prosperity without fairness becomes decay. Every winter ends the same way, the ground frozen, silent, waiting, and then one morning a single green shoot breaks the frost. That is how civilizations return, not with conquest or policy, but with remembrance of how balance was lost and how it must never be lost again. When this winter ends, those who held on to patience instead of panic, truth instead of illusion, and community instead of comfort, they will be the architects of the next spring. The middle will rise again. Not as a class, but as a conscience, the quiet force that reminds every generation that no empire survives by wealth alone.